Now, this is an example from Chinese reasoning, and this is a quotation from a book published in 1985 by a fairly well-known landscape architect who lives in Shanghai. The book is both in Chinese and in English. I'm quoting the English translation. In Chinese, the word song, meaning pine tree in English, and the word song, which is equivalent to looseness in English, are homophones. They sound the same. So not only is this a homophonic argument, but they share the same radical too. That's how it's written. That is to say, according to the Chinese, pine trees look their best when the branches and twigs are not thickly interwoven and the foliage is not dense. So let me just deconstruct this a little bit. The word for pine tree, up there, song, and the word for loose, you can see it's got the word for pine tree in the second half. The bottom part is identical to the character for pine tree. The top part means long hair. And so loose is long hair, but the sound of it comes from the part that means pine tree on its own. It's merely a clue to the Chinese reader of the sound of the word. In fact, the presence of the word pine tree in the word loose is not, in fact, a relationship of meaning. There is no etymological connection between the two in the Western sense. It's simply a clue about the sound, how you pronounce it, how you say it. So, from a Westerner's point of view, to say the pine tree, song, and loose, song, are the same, therefore, plant pine trees loosely. So let's look at this a little more. Well, first of all, let me look a little bit at Chinese culture, 500 BC. Unlike Greek culture, it's very homogeneous. There's very little diversity, and people are primarily attached to the land. A paramount social issue is harmony in the culture. Farming and not trade is important, and farming always means permanence. Farmers can't pick up their land and go somewhere else, so they're tied to a particular location. Traditional agrarian Chinese inhabitants dwelled in their birthplaces all their lives, experienced little travel, little exchange of ideas with people whose life experiences were different. And unless they were displaced by war or refugees, which happened a lot in China actually, they would have probably spent their lives, and generations would have spent their lives in one place. With a primary focus in argumentation on ways to harmonize elements of society, to minimize conflict, which is difficult for a society that can't move around or accept new people and so on. The commitment is to reasonableness rather than reason in order to find an immutable truth. Finding those true identities of a thing wasn't of very much interest to Chinese. What they were interested in was finding ways to accommodate a variety of points of view. Difference can be destructive, and playing down difference takes away the threat of disharmony and imbalance. And ultimately, the basis of reasoning is that balance can be achieved, whatever the situational context. And the situational context is going to mean that the balance is going to be different from context to context. So factors that need to be accommodated in balance in one situation may not be present in another situation. So the idea of immutable truth is far less important than an idea about reaching a harmonious viewpoint that can accommodate different voices. The Chinese reasoning process then has to do with achieving equilibrium. And I'm going to show you an example of that. I'll come back to this slide. Oh, sorry. I thought my slides in a different order than I remembered. This type of reasoning will change with the circumstances and the kinds of counter-arguments that exist in a particular situation. And abstract premises are not of very much importance. What's important is achieving balance. And individual uniqueness just doesn't really matter very much. This is based on Taoist thought, and Taoism was around 500 BC. It's a very old way of thinking. In fact, Tao means the way, and Tao thought looks for ways to accommodate contradiction. It's the nature of this whole life philosophy. The I Ching is a collection of Taoist thought, largely attributed to Lao Tzu. Lao was a teacher. And here's a quotation early in the I Ching. For misery, happiness is leaning against it. For happiness, misery is hiding in it. Who knows whether it is misery or happiness? This is the image that really does summarize the desire for balance in this kind of thinking. Because this image, which is the yin-yang symbol, that appears on the Korean flag, is quite widely used in Asia, has as its two components yin and yang, which look like they're completely diametrically opposed opposites. And we're good at that in Western thought. We have, from Aristotelian thinking, the notion of exclusivity. Two things cannot be true at the same time. But in fact, in Taoist thought, two things must be seen to coexist together at the same time. And you can see that if the black bit grows, if that bulge begins to increase, the white bulge also increases. And each has a bit of the other in its makeup. So that you can see that this is a very interesting symbol for equilibrium, balance, a sense of harmony. Now, if this is in fact the way that people are trying to understand the world and develop a method of reasoning, reasoning is to achieve balance, let's go back and look at that pine tree and loose thing. Obviously that argument fails in Western ears because it lacks grounds. Saying that the words sound alike is merely an accident in arbitrariness in Western ears. We have words that sound the same, sail and sail, but we don't say that therefore boat sails must be on sail. We don't try to make a logical connection for an argument between them. So in terms of the Western approach to logic, there are no grounds for it. But let's go back and do a literal translation of this with the idea in mind that the Taoist principle may be informing the reasoning here of trying to accommodate contradictions. Pine is loose. The branch cannot be too much. The leaf cannot be too tight. Then you can see its shape. The strong and soft used together, you can see the effect. Now you get a sense from the literal translation, not the one that was the published English translation, that there is a paradox inherent here, which is the strong and the soft. And in fact, there is quite a long tradition in Chinese discussion of pine trees that they do embody, paradoxically, the strong and the soft. The trunk is strong, the needles are soft, and that this is a metaphor for the coexistence of things together. And that's something that's fairly well known. The Tao Te Ching gives us again some interesting examples of the notion of paradox working together. Tao means, as I said before, the way, the path of inquiry into the profound meaning of life. De means virtue. The word qing means guide. And sometimes in earlier transliterations, you will see it written T-A-O. That may be something you've come across. The T-A-O and T-E and C-H-I-N-G. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I knew wrong this before. I didn't realize you would do that. This is the pinyin, which is the modern transliteration of Chinese, so that's what I use. The Tao that is spoken of is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Let's see, the love, really the delight in paradoxical statements as a way of expressing truth, something that is very important, that captures meaning for a society. The Tao Te Ching is full of these things. This comes from section 22. It predates Lao Tzu, who is often considered to be the author of the Tao Te Ching, and it's old sayings. And you can see that they are constructing a parallelism in the worded structure. Should I read it, or can you read for yourself? Read it. Read it. To yield is yet to be preserved wholly. To be bent is to become straight. To be hollow is to be filled up. To be worn out is to be renewed. To have little knowledge is to gain. To have much knowledge is to be perplexed. That always appeals to students. And you can see that this parallelism in the phrasing is a kind of enactment of the notion of balance, of equilibrium. There is this, and then there is this. One time when I was a consultant in Canada, I did a lot of consulting for the Canadian International Development Agency, otherwise known as CIDA, and I was preparing people to go work in China. And I used to have to, the CIDA liked me to include a section in the pre-departure briefing on how to stay healthy in China. It's not hard to stay healthy in China. So I hired a Chinese I knew, a doctor, who had recently come to Canada, to do this. I thought that gave it a lot of credibility. And I said, here's what you should say. Drink boiled water, eat cooked food, you know. And she prepared her presentation, and it was summer diseases and winter diseases. And it was a really interesting example of this kind of thinking. How many of you have visited China? Have you noticed on the doorways, at the doorways of some buildings, some homes, there are two panels of writing, one on either side of the door, called duizi. And these are often parallel, they're kind of expressions of suggesting fortune, good prosperity, good fortune. And very often they'll be constructed this way. Well, I'm going to do something that's quite basic, okay? Not very sophisticated. So bird, air, flight, summer. Fish, water, swimming, winter. People laughing back there. so this would be, you know, the kind of thing, absolutely balanced. One panel is on one side of the door, the other panel on the other side of the door. And there are many other more sophisticated examples of this sort of desire to have balance in the universe. And I think we can see that this is the kind of, this parallelism to show balance is very much a way of reasoning in Chinese culture. It's not the only way, but it's an interesting example that doesn't occur to people in a Western logical tradition.